Well, I would say, the first decision you have to make is whether you want things to be better or worse. And it seems to me that better is a better aim. And if that's what you want, then you can orient yourself to becoming fully on board with that. That's your motif. And I would say that's love in the religious sense, is that love is the desire that all things flourish. And you might think that's evident. It's not evident. This is hard because things are difficult. It's easy to become spiteful and bitter and resentful, and to be self-denigrating and not to work for your own furtherance because you're ashamed of who you are, like deeply ashamed, maybe even ashamed to be human. The destructive species that we are, constantly raping the planet, that self-loathing can go very, very deep. So this is hard. But that's the first thing. Do you want things to be better or worse for you and for the people around you? It's like, well, so that's your goal, to make them better. Perhaps that's your goal. When I was a clinician, that's what I was always working on with my clients. It was like, I'm on the side of you that's aimed at making things better. No unconditional positive regard, because there's going to be parts of you that are working at counter purposes to that, and we're not on their side. They're to be judged and dispensed with, not in a contemptuous or dismissive manner, but with the knowledge that those elements of your personality are not serving the goal. And that doesn't mean that might be bringing them on board. So if you're aggressive, that can serve the good. That can make you persistent and committed and immovable, all those things. And then the next thing I would say is, watch for resentment, arrogance, and deceit. They're your enemies. And see if you can reduce the influence they have over your life. And then that's where you have to watch and feel, am I lying? Is this self-serving? Is what I'm saying making me weak? Can I feel that? Am I insisting that I'm right? Because I'd rather believe that I was right than learn. Am I taking revenge in a resentful way? Those are good questions of conscience. It's highly probable that you're doing that in many places. Maybe you can dispense with that carefully over time and see what happens. So it's worth running the experiment.
Yeah. And putting our everything into it, because that's where we'll really learn, by giving that endeavor.
Well, that's
towards
a good
our
aim. It's a good aim, but you can start with even a little couple of percents of you aim towards that. You can start badly. And that's a useful thing to know too, is like, you can improve your life a little bit at a time. And it's very difficult to be all in. We talked about that earlier. Who knows who you could be if you were everything you could be? That is a limitless case. What would it be like if you stopped doing all the stupid things that you're doing and took advantage of all the opportunities that came your way and aimed at the highest good? Who knows what you could be? You could certainly be more than you are. Everyone knows that, I think, and everyone suffers that knowledge. It's from that their feelings of inadequacy spring. That can be pathologized too. I know people can be way harder on themselves than is actually good for them. That's not what I mean. It's hard to distinguish between those even, but it can be done, I think.
What can you be? And that's inspiring. That's a story that's going to be told and lived out in this life. And everybody who watches you live that story will be inspired by that, because they'll be inspired to live their own story. And that's, I think, the most important message is, live as the hero and allow that to be, the fable that has grandchildren saying, I'm going to be whoever your name is, I'm going to be this person because you lived in such an inspiring way. And that's what draws me forward, and I think draws all the heroes forward of our time, and that's what we need right now.
And that isn't done at someone's expense.
Yeah.
Not if it's done right. It's done with the benefit of everyone else in mind. And that's a case I try to make in the book too. Like if you're acting in your own self-interest, because you're a community that stretches across time, you have to take your own future self into account constantly. And so impulsive selfishness is not useful, even selfishly. And so you can make the most out of yourself, I believe, without taking anything away from anyone else. It's only beneficial. Now, you know, people might be annoyed at you because you're more successful on some dimension than they are, and perhaps that hurts, but, well, if to deal with that, we'd have to eradicate the possibility of ever being better at anyone ever being better than anyone else at anything. And it doesn't seem to me that we want to push equality that far. Yes, and I think at the darkest edges of the demand for equality have that horror at their root. It's like, well, you're going to take away from everyone what they have to offer by insisting that everything is equal. It's like, no, you want people to be able to trade the best they have with other people. That's a good deal for everyone. Every ideal is a judge. And that makes perfect sense, because an ideal is something to which you aspire. And the gap between you and that ideal, if it's your ideal, is felt as judgment. And so that's one of the reasons people are very afraid to have an ideal, to make it. That's why I wrote, do not hide things in the fog. It's like, well, you should lay out an ideal. You should pursue an ideal. Why wouldn't you? Well, when you make your ideal explicit, it turns into your judge. Well, then you can listen to that judge and move forward and transform. But, you know, it's pretty damn harsh. Because especially to begin with, you posit an ideal, especially if you're in a mess. God, every bit of you is being judged as unworthy.
Yeah.
There's endless reasons not to want that.
The mercy comes from saying, this is the ideal, but the expectation of judgment that I'm going to be at that right away is false. So let me appreciate myself right here where I am in this journey with all of my faults, however many they are, open up my entire closet of internal monsters, pet them on the head and say, okay, here we go, eliminating more of those and becoming more like the ideal, surrendering to the journey rather than that expectation. And there, the judge no longer carries the sting and the bite and the harshness, because you're judging yourself according to a timeline where you're hoping to get closer to this.
Yes, well, and the hallmark starts to become improvement.
Right.
It's exactly. Like, and that's great. That's a really sustaining, that's a really sustaining process too, because technically speaking, again, seeing yourself move towards a desired goal is the essence of the positive emotion that nourishes us. And I mean that technically. That's dopaminergically mediated incentive reward. And so you don't have to get to the goal. You have to aspire to the goal and move towards it. And that doesn't even matter if the goal recedes, which it will as you approach it, because your ability to conjure up what constitutes the ideal is going to become more sophisticated as you move towards it. And you might think, well, that's terrible, but it isn't, because it means the game doesn't have to end. Right? Because if you'd hit the ideal,
yes.
It's like, oh, well, game over, reset, but no, that isn't going to be how it works. It's going to get better and better and better. And
it's why life is the perfect game. I mean, if you have a really good, for those of us who've played video games, you have a really good video game, or even a really good book, or even a really good movie series or a show, and it comes to the end and you're like, oh, there's a huge letdown at the termination of this thing that's been incredibly engaging, especially
even if you win.
Yeah, exactly. You win and you get this moment's satisfaction, but it's replaced almost immediately by the disappointment of the cessation of the game and the recognition that you're in a finite game when you really want to be playing the infinite game. And that's what life is, the infinite game of renewal of life. And that's why it's so good. We'll never replace it. It can't get better. And it's hard as hell. And it's hard as hell at the same time. And that's the way we would want it.
Well, it seems like that's the way we want it. I mean, that's another thing I talk about a little bit in the new book, is like, well, when you look back on your past, it's generally having done something difficult that you remember positively, I would say. I'm in terrible pain almost all the time. And I do mean terrible. If in my previous life, when I was healthy, I had ever felt like I always feel now, I would have immediately gone to the emergency ward. But it's not helpful. As far as I can tell, as far as I've been informed for that matter, there isn't anything that can be done about the condition that I'm in. And that's rough. I have to remind myself all the time of what I should be doing, even to continue living for that matter. And I'm constantly reminding myself to be grateful as an act of courage. And I do explain that a little bit in Beyond Order. Something I really realized about gratitude is that gratitude at one level is an act, it's a voluntary act of courage. And I'm not trying to make out a case for myself being particularly courageous. That isn't what I mean. I mean that it's a risk to be grateful. It's a decision that opens you up in some ways. And you're sort of grateful despite it all. It's a great gratitude, I suppose, as a marker of faith. And that faith is even, in some sense, belief in the impossible. Despite all this, it's good. And I have to remind myself of that all the time. And I do that with prayer. I mean, I say grace with my wife. We only share one meal together, but we always say grace. And I actually think, in some sense, that's a really good part of my day. The time we do that. And that comes as somewhat of a surprise. And it's a relatively recent practice for the two of us. Not that we weren't trying to be grateful before, but we've both gone through our respective hells in the last 2 years. Because my wife had a very terrible cancer. It was terrible, and terrible surgical complications. And she was on death's doorstep for months and months and months. And in any case, we remind ourselves constantly to be grateful. And I'm always trying to watch what I say and to feel it out so that I use my words carefully. Yeah, well, in my new book, I have a chapter, which is Rule 11. Do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. It's kind of the evil triad as far as I've been able to determine. Resentment in particular. It's bad. It's a bad emotion. It's useful. You can learn a lot by noticing that it occurs. Resentment tells you one of two things. One is that that someone's treading on your territory and something needs to be done about it, or that you need to grow the hell up and stop complaining. And it's hard. It isn't necessarily obvious when you feel resentful which of those it is, but you need to figure it out, because you can harbor resentment for unlived life for a very, very long period of time. And all it does is corrupt you. It hurts you. It hurts you physically because it's a stressful emotion. Anger is a stressful emotion. Because your body hyper prepares for action if you're angry, because you might get into conflict. And that's a dangerous situation. And so you burn off a lot of psychophysiological resources in anger. If you're resentful, there's probably something you need to say. There's certainly something you need to figure out. And so you can use it as a guide to further development. It's very much useful to aim at a resentment-free existence. And that means, I suppose, that you're taking up enough space. There's always a struggle between your domain and the domain of other people. Everyone competes for everyone else's attention. Everyone competes for everyone else's time. You compete for your own time. And if you're resentful, it's highly probable that, well, as I said, either you're not standing up for yourself sufficiently, or someone is legitimately on your case, in which case you need to do something about that. Or, live with the consequences, which is very unpleasant. It's not optimal. Sometimes I suppose it's unavoidable. But, generally there's something that can be done about it. some things, if you don't address them, they just get worse. And I've been able to see where things are going to go. It's kind of like what I mentioned to you earlier, that if I watch someone, I can generally figure out what they're up to. I also can see where things are going. And so, you know, if I walk into someone's house and there are things out of order in a particular way, if I pay attention to that, that's often indicative of something not right in the relationship. You know, maybe the kitchen's a mess. It's like there's food that isn't fresh in the fridge, for example, or there's packages up in shelves that haven't been opened for like 2 years, or since the wedding, let's say. That's too much chaos in the kitchen. Something's wrong. Well, what's wrong? Well, there's something wrong in the domestic relationship there. The bargaining about who does what in the kitchen hasn't been fought through. And so you have to have those fights to put things in order. And if you don't, then you end up with a worse fight in the future. And so the reason that I call things out, as far as I can tell, the positive reason, who knows what the negative reasons are, is because I don't want more conflict. I'd rather have genuine peace, which is very, very, very hard to obtain. People generally obtain peace by sweeping things under the carpet. I have another chapter in this new book called Don't Hide Things in the Fog. And that's what it concentrates on, is pay attention to your negative emotions. Resentment particularly, it's so informative. You find out where you're immature. Well, do you want to? Probably not. Who wants to find out that? Or you'll find out who's oppressing you. And maybe then you can learn to stand up for yourself. Dostoevsky, I think, said something like, every man is responsible for everything that happens to him and everything that happens to everyone else. And that's, you know, it's a crazy statement, right? It's a crazy statement, and he was a pretty extreme person in many, many ways. But there's a level at which that's metaphysically true, you know, because what happens is that it's failure to act often that's the most catastrophic. You know, I mean, it's to not do the right thing when the situation presents itself, and it's very specific. You know, you're constantly in situations where you could do the right thing if you were willing to take a risk that's actually of relatively moderate size, and you know that you could take the risk, and you know that you should take the risk, and you don't. And that happens to people all the time. And then what happens is the thing that they didn't oppose grows a little bit, and they shrink a little bit, and that starts a loop, hey? And you say, well, how do you take responsibility for the world? And the answer is, well, you also have to do it with a certain degree of humility, because what do you know? You know, and this is part of the reason that I'm so opposed to the activist culture on college campuses. You don't teach 18-year-olds to go and demonstrate about capitalism, you know, because they don't know anything, and they have problems in their own life that need to be solved that are local. And the local problems aren't trivial, you know, they're not disciplined. They're not looking at the world in a straight way. They're not taking responsibility for themselves or for their actions, their sexual actions, among others. They're not taking responsibility for their family. They're not looking at how they could contribute to the community. They don't understand the fact that they don't know anything. And so they should be taught to start locally and to put things together that they could put together. You know, to make their bed and to clean up their room and to attend their classes with regularity if they're going to university, because that's part of the implicit contract, and to straighten up the things around them that are actually within their power to straighten up. And then what happens is that if you do that, let's say religiously, which I suppose would be the same as in a disciplined manner, that your realm of influence starts to grow, but it grows in a positive way, just like you can end up in hell one step at a time. And that's extraordinarily well documented. You can end up at the opposite place of that one step at a time, but it's also that same gradual process. You don't get to leap from being a 17-year-old knothead who doesn't know anything and who isn't disciplined to the critic of Judeo-Christian society. You just don't know enough to do that, especially when you can look at your own life and think about how many things that you're doing that you know are wrong, that you could fix, that you aren't fixing. And that's the crucial thing. This mode of thinking isn't asking people to stretch themselves beyond what they're capable of. It's just asking them to stretch themselves to the point that they are capable of and seeing what happens. And that works. It works. I've had many people write me over the last year, and this is a great thing, really, it's a great thing, who said that they started to tell the truth, or at least not to lie, because who can tell the truth, right? But at least you can not lie. And that they started to put things in order around them that they could put in order, and that, you know, the positive things just started to happen like mad, and they're not nihilistic, and they've got a purpose in their life. And so, you know, thank God for that, and it does work. You are the center of the world, as center of the world. It has many centers. And you do partake in this process of casting the potential of the future into the reality of the present and the past. That's what your consciousness does. And the quality of what you produce is dependent on the ethics of your choice. Your choice between good and evil in every moment is what determines the course of the world, and that's on you. It's like, well, that's deeply meaningful, but it's unbelievable. It's ultimate responsibility in the literal sense. And I think that in order for us to set things right, we have to understand that we have to take on that burden of ultimate responsibility, as if it's not only as if it's ours, which it is, but as if there isn't anything better that we could do. And one of the things that I found so gratifying about the lecture tour that I've been doing is that, and why I keep doing it, the live events in particular, because we've done about 100 of them now so far, is that when I explain to the audiences, and this is especially true, seems to be especially true of men, but of young men, but not so young even, to say, look, you have an ethical obligation to lift the heaviest load you can possibly conceive of, and that's the primary call to adventure in life. And that call to adventure is so worthwhile that it justifies the particularity. Everybody, it's like lights go on. They think, oh, I see. So you need a meaning to set against the suffering and to protect you against that temptation towards malevolence. You need that. Well, where's the meaning to be found? Well, it's not happiness. It's not short-term pleasure. It's not self-development. It's not self-esteem. It's none of those things that are so focused on the individual psyche even. Yeah. It's literally the stumbling uphill towards the city of God with your burden. And people go, well, that's where the meaning is, and they know that because they know responsible people. They know they admire responsible people. They already got that. Say, well, that's what you should become, and they think. And not only that, that's what you could become, because that's what you are in the deepest sense. Yes. All right, what does my average daily schedule consist of? Well, that's fairly straightforward. I get up around somewhere between 6 and 8, and then I work till 10, as hard as I can, flat out, every single day. So, and I've been doing that with very little variation, although it's been much more extreme in the last year since 1985. Like I work I would say 14 hours a day. At least 14 hours a day, and so that's about 100 hours a week. And the time that I don't do that, I spend with friends, but mostly with my family. And so, and I work as efficiently as I possibly can. I'm always trying to do everything I can as fast as I possibly can, and I'm accustomed to that because, like I said, I've been doing it for 30 years. So that's my daily schedule, and I don't know even what I would do if I didn't do that. I have this cottage that I go to, although I generally spend time writing up there, and I go swimming with my wife, and we go canoeing, and I can take a break in that way. But most of the time, if I take a break even up at the cottage, generally what I do is like carpentry and fix the place up, and I don't like to be unoccupied. I have to be occupied doing something productive all the time, because otherwise I'm not pleased with myself. And so, and you know, I decided a long time ago that I was going to try to live a hyper efficient and hyper productive life. And so it's been a challenge. It's an enjoyable thing for me to some degree, because I'm very interested in trying to figure out how much I can possibly do in the shortest period of time all the time. And that keeps you alert and awake, and it's a great challenge, and it lends my life a substantial amount of meaning, and it's been very successful. So, and that efficiency thing is really fun. If you guys who are listening are out for a challenge, like, one of the things that you can, I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like, discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And you know, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Look, figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too, if you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is, see if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient. You know, sometimes it means you have to delegate. Sometimes it means you have to bring other people aboard. That's delegation as well, I suppose. But there's a lot of preconceptions that you hold about who you are and who the world is that you could dispense with, that would make you a way more efficient actor in the world. It's unbelievable the degree to which our sanity depends on a functioning sociological structure. And here's why. Well, first of all, you kind of need to know what to do every day. You have to have a routine, because you're an animal, you know. And, you know, if you have a dog or a cat, dogs are a really good example of this. Dogs like routine. They like to be walked the number of times a day that they're supposed to be walked, and they get quite sick very rapidly if you don't routinize their days. Children are exactly the same way. Now, you can overdo it, right? But still, you know, you need to know approximately when you should get up. It should be approximately the same every day. You need to know approximately when you're going to eat. You need to know what you're going to eat. You need to know who you're going to eat with. You need to know where to buy your food. It's like 80% of your life, 70% of your life, something like that, consists of those things that you do every single day, that you repeat. Well, so you need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane. Now, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit odd, you can deviate 5% from the norm, or 10% from the norm, or something like that, carefully and cautiously, as long as the rest of you is all well ordered in a normative manner. You might be able to get away with that, and you might be able to sustain it across time, and people might be able to tolerate you if you do it, or maybe you'll get really lucky and you happen to be creative but reasonably well put together, and people will actually be happy that there's something idiosyncratic and unique about you. But even under those circumstances, mostly what you want is to have a routine that's disciplined, that's predictable, and bloody well stick to it. You're going to be way healthier and happier and saner if you do that. And then the other thing that you need, because this is one of the things the psychoanalysts got wrong, I think, is that they overestimated the degree to which sanity was a consequence of being properly structured internally, you know. Because from the psychoanalytic point of view, you're sort of an ego, and that ego is inside you. And of course, it rests on an unconscious structure. But the purpose of psychoanalysis is to sort out that unconscious structure and the ego on top of it, and to make you a fully functioning and autonomous individual. But there's a problem with that, because the reason that you're sane as a fully functional and autonomous human being isn't because you've organized your psyche, even though that's important. The reason that you're sane, if you're
if you have a well-organized unconscious. And ego is because other people can tolerate having you around for reasonably extensive periods of time and will cuff you across the back of the head every time you do something so stupid that people will dislike you permanently if you continue. And so what people are doing to each other all the time, just non-stop, is broadcasting sanity signals back and forth, right? It's like you smile at people if they're not only behaving properly, but behaving in a way that you would like to see them continue to behave. You frown at them if they're not, you ignore them if they're not, you shun them, you roll your eyes at them, you manifest a disgust face, you don't listen to them, you interrupt them, you won't cooperate with them, you won't compete with them. It's like you're blasting signals at other people about how to regulate their behavior so frequently, well, it just makes up all of your social interaction. That's why we face each other and we have emotional displays on our face and we're looking at each other's eyes and we know as much as we can about what's going on with each other, given that we don't have immediate access to the contents of their consciousness. And so partly what you're doing with your routine is establishing yourself as a credible, reliable, trustworthy, potentially interesting human being who isn't going to do anything too erratic at any moment. And everyone else is around there tapping you into shape, making sure that that's exactly what you are. And that's how you stay sane. And so what happens to people too, if they don't have a routine and they get isolated, is they start to drift. And they drift badly because the world is too complicated for you to keep it organized all by yourself. You just cannot do it. So we outsource the problem of sanity. And it's very intelligent that we outsource the problem of sanity because sanity is an impossibly complex problem. And so the way that we manage the incredibly complex problem is we have a very large number of brains working simultaneously on the problem all the time.
Do you plan your day much, or your time generally? Does this lead to higher productivity? Yes, I plan my day obsessively. My calendar is always absolutely full and often weeks in advance. And I plan in the morning, especially when I'm on top of things. And I plan each hour, and I probably plan each minute. And yes, it leads to way higher productivity. You know, you decide what your goals are going to be. You place them in the calendar. Use the calendar as your friend, eh? Because what you want to do with the calendar is design a day that you want to have, or a day that would be good for you. And a day that would be good for you is one that you're when you end the day, you feel that you've moved yourself ahead towards your valued goals, and that you've kept chaos under control. And that enables you to sleep soundly and with a good conscience, and to know that the next day is going to be at least not worse than that day. Planning is unbelievably useful. You need to figure out what it is that you're aiming at and why, and then you need to figure out how you're going to break that down over the months and the weeks and the days. But I would approach your calendar like it's your best friend. You think, okay, I'm going to design a week, man, that I really want to have. And that means you can schedule in leisure and all the things that you want to do, which you absolutely should do. And it's also quite fun to give yourself minimal time to do something complicated, because it's quite challenging to see if you can do far more than you thought in far less time. And so that's a fun game. And the other thing you can do is, like, if you're avoiding something, you could schedule in 5 minutes of it and say, well, like if you're avoiding looking at some bills because you're afraid of them, your first step might be to schedule in 5 minutes where you just look at the bill. You don't do anything else. And, you might be able to entice yourself into doing that. But I would say learning to plan is unbelievably useful, to schedule your time, because that's your life, But schedule the life you want. That means you have to schedule your responsibilities obviously, because responsibilities are those things that ruin your life if you don't fulfill them.
Maybe you decide you want to clean your room, and it's a hell of a mess, and you're working with a therapist, and he says, look, just open one of the drawers and look at it, because you've been avoiding it for 5 years. That's all you have to do this week. Open it and look at it. And on the one hand, that's so trivial and it's pathetic, but on the other hand, no, it's not. And so often the person will come back and say, well, that I did it, but it was just stupid. It's like, no, it wasn't.
your room isn't clean, but you opened the damn drawer, and now it's time to give yourself a pat on the back. But to do that, you have to admit, in some sense, you have to admit how pathetic you actually are. You know, you have to admit how pathetic you are before you can reward yourself. And that's okay, because that patheticness, well, it's sort of built in to the fact that you're vulnerable, you know, and you need a small step and you need a reward. That's okay. It's okay that that's the case. You know, when you see people, what they'll do is they'll say, well, that, you know, that's just a good indication of how useless I am. You know, that's all I could do. So they punish themselves. Well, then you have an opportunity. You say to them, look, there's two things going on here. You can't clean up your room. That's a problem. But you also can't reward yourself properly. So we need to take that apart and fix that so that you can reward yourself properly. And that's also why, you know, when I suggested to people that they clean up their rooms, the reason I did that was because I actually knew how difficult that is. Because to get your room in order, there's no way you can get your surroundings in order without simultaneously getting yourself in order, at least to some degree. And it's for exactly the reasons I just discussed. What you'll find is the reason the mess is there is because of psychological mess. You know, assuming it's not, you didn't just move or something, you know what I mean? There might be obvious situational contributors, but generally speaking, is the mess, the external mess, is absolutely isomorphic with the individual mess. And so it's really powerful to order and beautify something in your immediate environs. It's unbelievably powerful to do that. You learn a tremendous amount. You also may find, for example, maybe your family's dysfunctional. And part of the reason that your room is such a bloody mess is because if you ever took any steps to address it, they would punish you. Because as soon as you start to clean up your room, then you cast a dim light on their mess. And so they see you taking a step forward, they're going to whack you because now you're an ideal that's judging them. So you deal with someone who is in a dysfunctional family and you ask them to do something positive to move forward, and then you watch the resistances that emerge, and you've got a picture of the pathology in the family, and that can help the person start to sort that through. Because maybe they can say it, and like you have to do a lot of negotiating and thinking before this is a possibility, but maybe you say, well, look, you have to have a talk with your mom. You have to say, look, Mom, I'm doing something good here, and your reaction is to punish me. What the hell is up with that? Now, that's a complicated conversation, and maybe you have to start with something even smaller than that, but you get the point. You know, these things aren't simple. They're not simple at all. And luckily, though, they're right in front of you. You can, in fact, do it, and you'll learn a lot from doing it.
If you feel like you're built for more, if you want to grow, if you want to improve, if you want to become a better human, but you don't have people around you that also want to, you're scared that you're going to lose friends. You're scared that you're going to be alone as you start to go out on a journey of self-improvement. How can people find the courage to do that?
Well, one thing they can do is contemplate the consequences of not doing it. You lose friends. Well, you're going to lose the friends who don't want the best for you. Those are the friends you want in 10 years? I mean, you lose friends. Well, maybe you gain new friends. Maybe you gain better friends. Or maybe, miracle of miracles, your friends pick up their mess too and move forward. Maybe not. And I'm not naively optimistic about such things. But you have to contemplate the price you pay for inaction. And this is something I did with my clients all the time. It's like, well, I don't want to change jobs. Well, no wonder. It's like you have to go put yourself out to be interviewed. You have to send out 500 resumes. You have to be rejected 499 times. You have to polish your interview skills. You have to update your CV, which means you have to take a real look at the inadequacies in your preparation. And maybe you won't find a better job. It's like, no wonder you're afraid of that. Okay, you're in this job you hate, and it's 10 years from now. How does that look? Think about that. You already know you're in a little hell. You know perfectly well it's going to get worse. Which is more frightening? Action or inaction? Well, the thing about inaction is you're blind to it, eh? So you can hide from it. Well, that's chapter 3 again. Do not hide things in the fog. Do not make the assumption that inaction has no price. And so then you think, I'm terrified of this, but I'm even more terrified of that. And, you know, people have asked me, for example, I suppose why I was willing or am willing to engage in the troublesome process of objecting when I think something isn't going well. Because I'm more afraid of the consequences of inappropriate silence. It's not that I'm brave. It's that I'm more terrified of the alternative. So I don't engage in the alternative. And I don't know, maybe I have a knack for that to some degree. Maybe it's a consequence of clinical training, but you know, I can walk into people's houses and look around and I think, okay, there's something up here. And I mean, people have that ability. You know, I walked into a house once and the dishwasher was in the middle of the kitchen and it was undone and had obviously been there for a couple of weeks. And the fridge had food in it that was no longer food. And the cupboards had unopened wedding gifts in them, like 5 years after the marriage. I thought, there's a lot of things in this household that are being swept under the rug. And that was all laid out in the practical environs. It's like they hadn't negotiated who was responsible for cleaning the fridge. They hadn't even been able to open their wedding gifts. It's like something's rotten, deeply so. And so I could see where that was headed without a tremendous amount of effort on the part of the people. And it didn't work. They were divorced, you know, a couple of years after that in a very ugly manner or for very ugly reasons. Well, I knew where that was headed, you know, and under different circumstances, I would have said, what the hell is that box doing there? Oh, you know, it's nothing. Yeah, no, wrong. It's not nothing. That's a little portal to hell. I can see it, and so could you if you looked, but you won't. And I mean that literally, because people won't look. They'll walk into a room like that, and they will not look at that thing. Absolutely. And that's because if they look, they'd see. And they don't want to see, and no wonder, but the consequence of blindness is worse. It's worse. I mean, I have this, you know, my family would like some peace because I seem to be embroiled in one thing after another. And, you know, they have a point, but peace is very hard to obtain. And I can't be blind to what I see in the broader world around me. Not if I see it. If I see it, it's like, there it is. I'm going to say something.
For better or worse, life is short. How can we add a sense of urgency to it?
Well, I would say by reminding yourself that life is short, that'll add a sense of urgency. By noticing, you know, I calculated, I don't know, when my parents were in their 70s, 60s perhaps, I usually saw them about once every 2 years. We communicate a lot more than that, but we live a long ways apart. So I calculated, you know, well, my dad's probably going to live till his mid-80s or late, you know, somewhere in there. And he's 70, let's say. I'm going to see him 40 more times. It's like, okay, 40 more times. That's urgent. So you better get it right, because you don't have it. You don't have that many opportunities. You know, it's the same when you're formulating relationships in your adolescence, late adolescence, and early adulthood. You don't have that many experiments to run. You know, and you get old a lot faster than you think. So attention is an underrated faculty. It's not the same as thinking. It's watching. to see what's there in front of your eyes and to guide yourself as a consequence of what you perceive. It's the faculty that transforms thought if you let it. So, and your conscience alerts you as well. Tick, 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 you're wasting time. And very few people are happy with that. Some are burdened by it more than others, but virtually no one escapes that voice of conscience. I suppose to some degree that's the willingness not to engage in self-deception. Chapter 3 in Beyond Order is about that. People don't really repress the things they don't want to face, they just fail to unpack them. Like maybe you're on YouTube regularly, and every time you shut the computer off, you feel somewhat disgusted. But you don't pay any attention to that for a while, for 2 years. But then you decide you're going to pay attention. And then you find out, well, the reason you're disgusted is because you're wasting your life and you know it. And that disgust is indicating that. But unless you attend to the disgust and unpack it, let it reveal itself as informative, you don't know what the message is. You just have a sense of disquiet. It's not easy to transform that sense of disquiet into an actionable plan. And often you have to talk to someone about it as well. You have to discover. So it's not like you're repressing the emotion exactly. It's that you don't undergo the difficult process necessary to unpack it.
Here's an example of the Pareto distribution. There's a rule of thumb that if you run a company that 20% of your employees do 80% of the work, or that 20% of your customers are responsible for 80% of your sales, or that 20% of them are responsible for 80% of the customer service calls. Same thing, but that's not exactly the rule. The rule is worse than that. The rule is, in a given domain, the square root of the number of people operating in that domain do half the productive work. So you think, well, you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. It's like, yeah, okay. What if you have 100 employees? Then 10 of them do half the work. What if you have 1,000 employees? Well, then it's 30. And if it's 10,000 employees, then it's 100. And this actually turns out to be a rather ironclad rule. It applies across very, very many situations. It applies, for example, to the mass of stars and the size of cities. So you can see how universal it is as a law. And it's something like those that have more get more, and those that have less get less. That's the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And the economists sometimes call that the Matthew principle. And so what that lays out is a world that's rife with inequality. So you hear this idea that I think it's the 85 richest people in the world have more money than the bottom 2 billion. That's a Pareto distribution phenomena. And you might say, to hell with capitalism for producing that. It's like, sorry, you got your diagnosis wrong. It's a natural law. It's no matter what society you study, you get a Pareto distribution of wealth. You get a Pareto distribution of number of records recorded. You get a Pareto distribution of number of songs written or goals scored. Like any creative product has that characteristic. And it's partly because as you start to become successful, let's say, people offer you more and more opportunities. And as you start to fail, people move away from you and you plummet. And so, okay, so that's rough. So what it means is that there is always a landscape of inequality. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about it, although I am saying that we don't know what to do about it. That's the thing, because you can modify the Pareto distribution of wealth, let's say, but we don't know how to do it without maybe disrupting the system so completely that it collapses, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, for example, and in Maoist China. They were trying, at least in principle, to adjust inequality. But the cure was far worse than the disease. And the truth of the matter is, we actually don't know technically how much inequality there has to be to generate wealth. We can guess, and you could say, well, there should be less, and you might say, well, there should be more. If you're left-wing, you'd say less, and if you're right-wing, you'd say, well, we'll just let the inequality flourish. But we do know that it's inevitable, and we also know that we don't know how to regulate it. So, there is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous, and you can get bitter, and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless. I have this this friend of mine, he told me something so funny. He was decrying his lack of success in the world, and he compared himself to his roommate. And he said, you know, his college roommate was doing much better than he was. And his bloody roommate was Elon Musk. It's like, really? Like, it's like, oh, you're not doing as well as Elon Musk. Well, I mean, you can see it would take it rather personally because they were roommates and everything. It wasn't like he was doing badly. Like, he was doing pretty damn well. It's like, I'm not as good as Elon Musk. It's like, yeah, well, you and like 7 billion other people, you know. But I thought it was instructive because you have to be careful who you compare yourself to. Now, you can't just not compare yourself to successful people, right? Because then you don't have anything to aim at. And one of the things I learned from Jung, this was a cool thing, I'm going to make a real lateral move here. Jung thought the book of Revelation was appended to the Bible because the Christ in the Gospels was too merciful. He was too nice a guy. Now, he's an ideal, right? And Jung said, wait a second, an ideal is always a judge. That's the thing about an ideal, because you're not as good as your ideal, so your ideal is a judge. Revelation has Christ coming back as a judge, and that was Jung's explanation at the level of the collective unconscious for the pasting of that remarkably strange and terrible book onto the end of the Bible. So, well, anyways, my point is an ideal you need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? So I was trying to work that out in the chapter, and this is something I've had to work out a lot as a clinical psychologist. It's like, well, let's say you need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, it's because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. It's also what you do with children, right? You want to push them because they need to grow up and be more than they are, right? But you don't want to crush them with constant failures. So what you do is aim high and make the goal difficult but proximal. So anyways, so that's one way of looking at it. But then the next thing is, you know, I've had clients, many clients in their 30s who are trying to, this is more true with women, I would say. A lot of women who are very high achieving and who established their career goals at 30 and then want to differentiate out their life. They want to have a husband, they want to have a family, they're trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the things I've noticed that around 30, you really have to stop comparing yourself in some ways to other people. And the reason for that is that the particularities of your life are so idiosyncratic that there isn't anyone really all that much like you, you know, because the details of your life happen to matter. And so maybe you compare yourself to some rock star or something like that, and you know, the person's rich and famous and glamorous and all that, but you know, they're alcoholic and they use too much cocaine and they've had 3 divorces, and it's like, how the hell do you make sense out of that? Is that someone that you should judge yourself harshly against or not? The answer is you don't know, because you don't know all the details of their lives. And who do you know that you can compare yourself to? That's easy. You. Yesterday. So here's a good goal. It's something like, well, aim high, and I really mean that. It's like, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Aim high, but use as your control yourself. It's like, so your goal is to make today some tiny increment better than yesterday. And you can use better, you can define better yourself. This doesn't have to be some imposition of external morality. You know where you're weak and insufficient, where you could improve. You think, okay, well, this is what I'm like yesterday. If I did this little thing, things would be just an increment better. And, well, that's a great thing because you get the ball rolling, and incremental improvement is unstoppable. You can actually implement it, and it starts to generate Pareto distribution-like consequences. It starts to compound. And I've seen that happen in people's lives over and over. People write me all the time and tell me that they're doing that, but I've seen that happen in people's lives continually. They make a goal that, the goal should be, how could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful. Like, that's sort of the bottom line, right? Because that's what endless failure does to you. It's not good. And that's what life without purpose and a goal does to you as well, because life is very hard. So you think, okay, well, I need to adopt a mode of being that would justify my suffering. And you can ask yourself that question. What would make this worthwhile? I quote Nietzsche, I think, in that chapter. He said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." That's a lovely line, man. I mean, it's a lovely line. And it's really worth thinking about. So you think, well, how do I manage all this misery and suffering and futility? It's like, well, I need to figure out what I would have to do in order to make that clearly worthwhile. And so then you have your goal, and then you think, well, I need to move towards that incrementally, because I'm kind of useless and can only do so much, and maybe not even that. But all I have to do is be a little bit better than my miserable self yesterday. And that'll propel you forward very rapidly, and you can succeed at it, which is also really lovely, because why not set yourself up for success, you know, because otherwise you'll droop around like a number 10 lobster, and you know, that's just not good. You get all pinchy when that happens, and it's not a good thing. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat, and cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, you know. And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And you know, you have to look for those little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And you know, you narrow your time frame, and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times, and maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, you know, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. You know, there's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe, I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, is this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist. And maybe we could make the world into a better place, you know, and it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And that's the end of 12 Rules for Life.